Hey everybody, welcome to Love and Reload, the voice of the relocation industry. I am your host, Ben Cross, and I am joined by Ben Sookia. How are you doing?
Good, Ben, good. Thanks so much for having me back. Good to see you. I'm doing good here. Cold in London, but doing well, thank you. Good to see you.
This is so cool. So Ben, this week you are actually co-hosting with me because it's Africa Week here on Love and Reload. Why are we doing Africa Week, man? Tell people how this started.
So first of all, thanks for having me as a co-host. In my head, I've never been a co-host, so this is like the Grammys for me. So appreciate the offer. Looking forward to it. Why are we doing Africa Week? The reason why, in my opinion, is that we have lots of different voices in global mobility. We often hear from people in Asia. We often hear from people in the US and Canada, and we often hear from people in Europe. What we don't hear so much about is people in other regions. For example, Africa. Not many people know about Africa. And you and I connected a few months ago, and I told you about my background in Mauritius. And you then had René on the show, who talked about sustainability in South Africa. And you had the great idea to have a whole week of shows dedicated to Africa. So this is it. We're here. We've got 5 episodes in 5 days, and we're going to really go through what global mobility is like in the whole region of Africa.
Give people like a quick little snapshot. And by the way, if you're watching right now, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, throw a little heart out there to Ben and our guest who's backstage, who will be revealed soon, right? It's like the Masked Singer. I don't know if you guys have that in the UK, but it's a really big deal over here. Anyway, so also throw in the comments. Let me know who you are, where you're at, what you're up to, shout your company out, any questions you have. You know, that's awesome. We got a couple people chiming in right now. René, good to see you both. Now, René was instrumental in this also. So talk about a little bit about what you and René have kind of cooked up for us this week.
Yeah, so René and I have worked quite a lot and spoken quite a lot so that we could give a real broad spectrum of what global mobility is like in Africa. And what we've decided to do is give a range of opinions and voices of the industry. So we're gonna cover 5 different areas of global mobility. We're going to start off with HR and mobility policies today. So someone's going to talk about diversity and inclusion and important HR issues in the region. We're also going to touch on compliance. We're going to touch on moving and the challenges in the region there, because it's so different to the experiences that you have and Janet has in the US over there. And then we're going to have on Thursday someone talk about safety and security, some really interesting stories as well. And we're going to round up the week with my favorite subject, immigration. And we're going to have a real good range of guests from different countries in Africa. And they're going to just tell us a bit more about what it's like, what the challenges are, what the exciting things are, things that we don't know about. So we've got loads of good opinions and voices, and we're really looking forward to it.
All right, this is awesome. Okay, so without further ado, we got Tim checking in here. Hey, Ben and Ben. Yeah, Ben and Ben. That has a ring to it. I don't know. From Western hashtag WNY. That's awesome. Let's see here. Christian checking in from Sao Paulo. What's up? Oh, and here's another cool thing. And I almost forgot, before we bring our guest out, she's being so patient back there. And I thank you so much. We're going to get to you so quickly. But we also have a sponsor, right? So play that. There we go. Jacob Street. So we got a sponsor. So really cool thing we're doing this week for Africa Week is we have sponsors, and we are going to 100% of sponsorship dollars are going to benefit Mercy Joy Ministries to help kids in Uganda. So real quick, let me plug Jacob Street. Thank you so much. Jacob Street was founded to simplify insurance for the mobile workforce. They create policies that are specifically tailored to the relocation industry. Their full suite of services include personal liability, temporary housing insurance, transit, and health insurance with coverage in nearly every country. They are your one-stop shop for all global mobility insurance needs. If you'd like more information, please reach out to managing partner Elizabeth Soley. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And 100% of sponsorship dollars this week are going to Mercy Joy Ministries. And we've raised so far $2,500 to benefit kids in Uganda. So without further ado, Ben, who's our guest today?
Let's introduce our first guest of the week. It's Candice Watson, who is the Group Executive HR from AECI Limited. Hi, Candice. How you doing? Good to see you.
Hi, Ben. And Ben, it's absolutely lovely to be on your show, and to all your listeners from the most southern part of Africa, good afternoon. And I'm sure for the guys in the other parts of the world, it's probably good evening, right?
Yeah, it's 2:00 here, which I think is also throwing some people off too, because normally we do this 4:00 GMT -5, and it is 2:00 now. So we're a little ahead of the game here. What time is it, Ben, over there in the UK?
7 o'clock. It's dinner time here, so not too late. Just about right. Good time for a beer. So
there you go. Cheers.
So Candice, it's do you want to start off and just tell us a bit more about your background, your history in global mobility, and how you got into HR, and just give us a bit of information about you personally and your company as well, if that's okay?
Yeah, so sure, Ben. So I'll start with ACI. So ACI is an industrials company, chemicals company, providing mining solutions to mining customers. They've been around since the 1920s. But in the last sort of 50 years, diversified into chemicals. So they provide chemical solutions to a wide variety of customers, multinationals included, and we also do water treatment. So in partnership with a few providers across Africa. We currently employ about 7,500 employees across about 26 countries. And my role as the group human capital executive, of course, is to see how can we migrate talent seamlessly in the different territories that we require. So I think for me, when I think about my journey with global mobility, and this is why when René approached me about the show, I was quite intrigued, because usually we find that we draw talent from other regions of the world into Africa, and we're not really focused from a multinational point of view in terms of how to develop African talent for the African continent. And that's for a number of reasons, because when you think historically around the competencies that we have as an African continent, beyond our rich culture, good weather, it's still largely arable land. And if you think about multinationals, and that's historically where my experience has been with global mobility, you would find that multinationals is headquartered, for instance, when I worked for Pernod Ricard was in Paris, or when I worked with BAT, it was headquartered in UK. And it's almost as if we then do the transfer of skills from these more developed markets into the emerging market, which was Africa. So historically, my focus has been on developing talent within an African space. And I took on the challenge to join ACI, which is essentially international business, but born, bred, and headquartered out of Africa. And for us, it's now the reverse, where essentially we used to draw talent from the other areas and from other regions. Now I find myself in the position where, from a headquarter point of view, we're actually sending talent into different spaces. So we send talent into Germany, into Indonesia, and we operate across about 18 countries within Africa. So that's a little bit about my professional journey. From a personal point of view, I'm a mom of a teen and a tween. So there's never a dull moment in my home. And in my spare time for the past 3 years, I've been researching the underrepresentation of women in senior management, and specifically what practices of exclusion perpetuates the underrepresentation of women in management. So I'm my third year with the University of Cape Town doing a doctorate in the Faculty of Commerce. And we've gathered data over this period of time. We've reviewed the literature, and we're now in that final stage of analysis and really looking into, when you look at an African cohort and you look at African women in management, what is some of those nuances that we find across the African continent that really either acts as barriers to women progressing in management or actually facilitate women in management. And for me, when I spoke to René, I said, you know what, René, what we found in our study is that mobility is so important in terms of developing that rich career exposure to position women to take on some of these roles. So I hope that gave your listeners a little bit of a flavor of who I am and the organization that I'm involved with.
I'd like to just say, Candice, that was first of all tremendous introduction there and background there, and you've talked about so many topics, and I know Ben's got a ton of questions, and I just have a personal curiosity about so many things that you said, and I just want to. And Ben, would you indulge me just for a moment? And I just want to ask a couple questions. You mentioned going back to something you said in the beginning, right? Because there's so much to unpack here about women in leadership and everything. But going back to something you said in the past, where the paradigm had been the people from other regions, the talents from other regions would come into the African continent, and Africa would import talent.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the importance of cultivating talent, homegrown talent. Why is that? Can you discuss the dynamic and why it was the way it was, but also B, why it's so important to cultivate homegrown talent in the continent?
So I think I'll start with the safest answer, and that is legislation, right? So from a legislative point of view, whether you Africa or whether you're doing business in the other parts of Africa, they have what they call indigenization laws. And indigenization laws essentially requires organizations to empower locals within the areas in which they operate. And different governments would have different percentages of international expatriates versus local employees that they need to have in their management teams or in their operations. And then typically what would happen to get these sort of immigration visas, you need to have a skills transfer plan. So you need to demonstrate to the authorities in these different countries that there's a scarce skill that the organization need to operate within that country, and within a defined space of time, whether 3 years, 4 or 5 years, you will then do the transfer of those skills. So whichever multinational would send the skill into Africa. The dynamic we have back home in Africa in the different regions, and I'm sure when you read up reports with the World Health Organization, when you look at sustainability indexes, when you look at just the general emergence of the African economy, you find that the global world economy is demanding skills that African governments is not developing as yet. And those skills that we need from a multinational point of view, the only way to really get it is to accelerate the transfer of skills plan. So drawing the skills from elsewhere in the world and then bringing those skills and doing the transfer of skills. And I mean, it's no secret when you think about the quality of our education system. And, you know, the more I've traveled into Africa over the past few years, and of course into the Europe and the West, South Africa is not really a real reflection of the rest of the African continent, whether Central Africa, West Africa. I was in Morocco a few years ago, right? So you find yourself that the world economy has put this pressure on different countries to provide skills. And if you don't have those skills, you need to draw those skills from elsewhere in the world. And I think for us, this is why I joined ACIs, a South African and African born and bred organization, is to say beyond just drawing skills from elsewhere in the world, we also have a value proposition as talent in Africa. And this is why I focused my research in women specifically on an African cohort. Because what we find is the more we did our review of literature of women in management, a lot of the models has been developed in the West and more recently in the East. And we draw from these paradigms and these theories, and we inform management practices and leadership programs for women. But no one's asking the African woman, what about your experience? And for me, it was an ideal opportunity to bring the voice of African women into the research. And really, you know, for the rest of academia to say that we have a voice and we want it to be heard, and we have a contribution to make to this knowledge. So
Candice, let's make this real for a second, right, to people out there. I mean, the voice of the African woman hasn't been heard. If someone were to ask the African woman, what are they missing, right? I mean, Candice, just tell us, like, just from your, you know, your personal take on this. Let's make it kind of real to people out there. I mean, what would the voice of the African woman say?
So for me, I think the interesting thing is that, and I'm sure if I've got some ladies on the line, the one thing that came out in my research as either an inhibitor to your progress into management or it actually supports your program is your choice of life partner. And that is within a social context, specifically in Africa, very still patriarchal. You find there's still tribal cultures and traditions that still exist. And as much as women, we've gone to universities and we've studied and we've gained experiences and we've traveled, there's still very deep cultural practices that we would need to abide by. And the choice of life partner in most of my cohort has been the defining decision in terms of who's supported them and who's actually helped them make their career successful. Because if the woman's going to take the lead, the peer pressure at home for the husband, either to stay at home, which I've seen in Europe with some husbands, or to follow the wife as she is expatriated across Africa, that pressure oftentimes makes or breaks the relationship. So for me, that was a very interesting finding. Because sometimes you think it would be, maternity benefits or crash at work, or, we want to stay at home for 3 years. But one of the questions, because we had quite a multidimensional research instrument, was who's been your key support and how their support has enabled your progress. And 99% of the time was a choice of life partner.
Wow. Ben, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Candice. I was just wondering, through all the studies that you've done in terms of women in management, from a practical perspective, how do you implement those at AECI? What have you done to kind of encourage that in your own company?
So within ACI, our values is called bigger. So each one of the letters, B, which is being bold and sustainability, being engaged. So we took the bigger values and we said, well, our values as an organization really underpins everything we do. And we swapped the bigger and we called it Big Her. So H for woman, for her. And what we did is we put a program in place, because we recognize that the industry in which we operate, which is essentially engineering, mining solutions, so underground, deep surface mining, is not really appropriate, or it's not attractive to women. So we've got about a 20% to 30% female complement in our headcount, which is really comparative to our industry. And what we started with the basics, and I started with a group executive. And for the first time, ACI signed up with the pledges around International Women's Day, where it was each for equal. And we went out with a narrative where we said that our aim as the group executive is to create an ACI that's equal for all. And what does that mean? Equality in terms of policies, procedures, how we attract talent, how we develop talent. But beyond that, what's also come out of my research and what we've now started implementing at ACI is that women need to be mentored, and women need executive sponsors. So what we find around mentoring is we've now joined with Business Engage, and they are the flagship for the 30% Club, which really looks around women in boards internationally. And they do a number of talks throughout the year, where they bring seasoned female executives from boards in, and they talk to the women around what's been their journey, and how we can use those lessons to progress our career. So there's an element around buy-in at the top. So our group CEO is the sponsor of the program. Then there's around how do we create this culture for women to participate, identify that women need to be mentored, and then to create professional networks for women to actually have peer learning across the group. So those are some of the initiatives we've done internally. Externally, we've also partnered through our CSI fund to look at job creation for women in specific rural communities where we operate. And this year, actually, we were recognized for our contribution to socioeconomic development of women through the Business Engage Leadership Forum. So it's not just an internal approach, even though it's in its infancy stages, so it's year 2, but also around how do we plug the gap externally around women-owned businesses and doing socioeconomic development with women in rural areas.
This is fascinating. There's so much meaty topics here. We got so many great comments coming in. I want to ask you, if you're watching right now out there in the audience, hit that like button, throw in a comment. Want to hear your questions out there. We've got some really great ones. Ben, Candice, you mind if we take a couple questions and comments from the audience here?
That'd be great.
All right. See, Ben, you got me being more polite now. I'm asking permission.
I know, spread it.
You're rubbing off of me, man. Thank you very much, making me a better human. Let's see here, Francine. What's up, Francine? Hi, Ben, and Candice. This is really tripping me out with the Ben, and Candice thing. I'm like, wait, what?
It sounds like a little song, Ben, Candice. Like
it's like a song, yeah, like Duck, Goose, Ben, Candice. Okay, anyway, so hey, Francine, let me know if you got any questions out there. Renee says talent is such an essential part of social upliftment. Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about talent and mobility, and let's tie it all together. I know we got some practitioners out there as well. Let's see here. Hi, Candice. Which countries in Africa do you typically see talent emerging from for export to outside of Africa? Tamlin Kuhn.
Great question, Tamlin. And what I will share is based on my practical experience, because I'm an African. I've been born here, bred here. I love the African continent. So I will say from every country in Africa, right? But what I've seen practically, South Africa, because we are a bit more developed, just because of the nature of our economies. So South African talent, and also because it's Anglophone, so English-speaking countries, you find that you can export talent from South Africa into territories like Australia, New Zealand, those parts of the world where we've done successful talent swaps. Within Lusophone Africa, which is the Portuguese-speaking countries, it's been easy for us to swap talent out from Portuguese-speaking Africa into LATAM, so into the Brazils and the Chiles. So it's a bit easier to translate talent across those territories. And further up in West Africa, so if you think about your Nigeria, it's been easier for them to send talent into the UK or into the US. And then further up also Francophone West Africa, translation of talent into Paris. So there is a component around the languages and cultural nuances, so people are easier to adapt. And this is just what I've seen in my own practical experience, where we've had talent being exported into those countries. But essentially, the talent swap and exchange would be to expose them to practices in more developed markets, and then to bring them back so that we see that talent reintegration into Africa, and that we can actually uplift the broader skills base in Africa, and we're not just losing the talent to the rest of the developed markets. I hope that answered your question, Tamlin.
Follow up on that, though. You mentioned language consistently, which is really interesting to think about how, the continent has so many kind of pockets of different language and culture, and how that makes suitable destinations. But besides language, are there other either cultural factors, educational factors, skill factors, or industry factors that kind of create matches like that?
So I think the beauty of a multinational, right, is that once you're inside the factory gate, so as I usually call it, the multinational culture is the precedent culture. It's about your product, your service, how you go to market, your route to market. And that makes it easier for talent to be transferred through the pipeline of an organization. I think it's more difficult if you don't go through the pipeline of an organization. And within different African territories, you would find that governments would release scarce skills lists to say these are the scarce skills that we need to develop the economy. And that in itself means that skill is not available within the country, or we're not producing it as quickly as we need to. So I think for me, beyond language, right, the only competence that's easy transportable is within the framework of the multinational products, services, or operations, how they run. And oftentimes you would find that they would have blueprint for their factories to say the way we produce product X, regardless of the territory, would be the same. And that means of production and how we set up the operations, and then obviously doing the skills plans, makes it easier for us then, including the language, to move people around.
Well, Tamlin says that was spot on. She loved that answer there, Candice. So thank you so much. I mean, this is great. This is great, really. And Juliana Ruiz from Brazil. Actually, you speak Portuguese, right, Ben Sookia?
Yeah, I do speak Portuguese. That's right. I think language, though, is a really important one to be able to transfer. And I think in global mobility, the fact that you're matching up Portuguese, because I think Angola and Mozambique, I think, speak Portuguese, so that the fact you can create that connection, I think, is interesting. Are there certain regions, is LATAM a region where there is a connection between Africa, or are there other regions where you see there's a lot of business and interaction, for example, Europe, or which are the kind of more prominent ones that you work with?
I think in my experience, it's definitely been LATAM and Southern Africa. And beyond the fact that I've traveled into those parts of the world, right? There's something around our culture, our humanity, the fact that we're on the side of the hemisphere. So it's almost, it's a bit easier from an alignment point of view beyond the time zones, obviously. And I think there's a bit more similarities in terms of my own experience, both culturally and in terms of, from a macroeconomic point of view, how these economies is set up. So for me, it would be LATAM and Southern Africa.
And you talked about networks before. Are there any international networks for women to learn more about? Because what I haven't seen, and maybe I'm mistaken, is I don't know many women's focused global mobility networks that promote exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about, that are more international. And maybe that's just me, but is that something that exists and connects people in the region of Africa to women?
I wish I could say, I've got a list, and the reality is we don't. So I belong to a few professional networks. But if I had to say, is there an international body that really taps into the African talent and the talent, the female talent that's available in our continent? I think sadly not. And this is why platforms like LinkedIn is so powerful, because I think it gives you the opportunity from a professional networking point of view to reach out to any person across any parts of the world. But we haven't formalized it as yet, and I think we shouldn't shy away from the fact that even as I'm taking the call today, I'm thinking to myself, I hope our connectivity is going to hold up, right? So we deal with issues like connectivity. At any point in time, we could have load shedding, electricity could get cut off. I remember on occasion a few years ago, I was traveling with my French CEO into Mozambique to go and show him the new offices. And we got there, and there was just no electricity, and people were literally just sitting in office spaces in the dark. And he was so shocked, and the people was like, "Yeah, no, the electricity is off today." So because and he was like, "What?"
Were you nervous about that though, Candice? I mean, you're bringing him here to say, "Hey, look at this." And
and there's no electricity, and that's the beauty and the agility of doing business in Africa, is that no one day is predictable. And you still have dark spots across Africa. But I think what makes Africa such a beautiful continent is that there's just this overwhelming sense of hope. And beyond hope, people are just eager for opportunities and for development.
That's awesome. I know. So we have connectivity issues. Anybody that's seen this show, especially when I was working from home as I am today, you know that there's connectivity issues here in the U.S. as well. But I remember the lights went off at a company I worked for like 5 years ago, and they were off for 2 hours. People were like, "You know what? I think that's our day. We're going home. Forget about it. We're out of here." And there's no resilience over here whatsoever. But we got a couple more comments coming here. I want to make sure we honor everybody's comments. One of my favorite commenters of all time, Gabby Bachhuber. "I'm blown away with this fascinating discussion already." Thank you, Gabby. "So many takeaways here. The choice of life partner, especially during COVID-19 pressures now, and in mobility always, is spot on." That's fantastic. Gabby, let me know what other questions you have for Candice here. You always ask such great questions, but here's a great follow-up to that from René Stegmann. "Could be an interesting interview question. Who is your partner and how do they support you?" So we're going to ask this question, and we're going to go around the horn. We're going to go around the horn. So Candice, you're not on the hot seat. We're all going to say, how are we supported? Who is that person in our life, whether it's our partner or someone else who supports us?
You're pointing at me first, aren't you? Always pick on me. Is Candice going first?
Yeah, this is co-host hazing time. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, I don't have a partner. I'm single. If there are any ladies there watching, my partner. Well, I don't have a partner, but I would say I have a best friend, and also my mum. I love my mum, so she's always there to help me. She was helping me today. She made me a sandwich and a cup of tea, and that was very supportive because I was helping my parents with something. So I'm well fed. I've had a drink, so I'm feeling good. So I shout out to my mum again today. I'll give the shout out to her for that.
And
question.
For all you ladies who are watching, that's a high bar right there. That sandwich and a cup of tea is high bar. Thanks, Ben. Sorry to put you on the spot. co-host. Candice, what about you?
So for me, it's a combination of people, right? So I had a partner for many years. It didn't work out. But I find that the expectation of society to have a significant other is important, but it's also important to have a network of people. So I have colleagues that I can rely on, family and friends, and more recently, there has been someone interesting and entertaining that I can lean on. But I think it's around just getting a combination of people to support you. And that's a very naughty question to ask, René. But nonetheless,
Yes, René.
I think that's my answer and I'm sticking to it.
Well, people always ask me, love and relo, what is that? Is that some kind of like relocation singles, community or something? I'm like, no, guys, no. But the more we talk, who knows? For me, my wife, I couldn't even begin to do any of this without her. I'd just be a total mess of a human being, to be completely honest with you. So she's the rock. Anyway, can't say it. I'm gonna start crying. Anyway, moving on. Naughty question, René. Naughty René. Okay, moving on here. Let's see. Shout out to Elizabeth Soley. Hello from Connecticut. Hashtag so I can't even. So Connecticut, South Connecticut. SoCon. Hello from SoCon. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your sponsorship today of Jacob Street Partners. You know what, Tim? Let's roll that second ad there, because this goes to benefit all the kids in Uganda. Not all the kids, select kids, very lucky kids. Jacob Street was founded to simplify insurance for the mobile workforce. They create policies that are specifically tailored to the relocation industry. Their full suite of services include personal liability, temporary housing insurance, transit, and health insurance with coverage in nearly every country. They are your one-stop shop for all global mobility insurance needs. If you'd like more information, please reach out to managing partner Elizabeth Soley. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your kind contribution there. This goes out to Mercy Joy Ministries in support of Ugandan youth. Let's see here. Let's see if we got any other comments. Keep those comments and questions coming. Oh, we've got some really great one. We got some really great one here, as well as people saying that they've actually met their husband through relocation. And so now that we can't go to in-person events, Love and Relo is going to become that meeting place. So Ben already put it out there. So if you'd like a date with Ben Sookia, put it in the comments. I'll set it up. Yeah, there you go. This is great. I'm sorry, Candice. Candice is like, what did I sign up for right now? This is ridiculous. One last question here from the audience for now. Candice, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, how do you think immigration legislation will need to adapt into the future? Great question.
So I think it's a fantastic question, René, and I don't like commenting on pieces of legislation that I'm not familiar with, right? But I think for me, when I think about diversity and inclusion, and specifically around women, I must say, from a practical point of view, I've been on the receiving end of expatriating more men with their families than women, single women, professional women, and women with their families. And that's just what I've seen in the reality of expatriation. And I don't think that even with the push from governments to say that we want equal societies, if you think about the sustainability goals, and you think about gender equity, and you think about the SDGs in the next sort of 10, 15 years, everyone is saying the same thing. We want to see a society that's equal for all. But beyond putting those limitations on immigration laws, I think for me, the first and primary question would be around what talent do we need to develop the economies of the future? And what I've just seen from a leadership point of view, some of the inherent capabilities of women is actually the leadership styles that the markets and economies is demanding now. So historically, where our management practice was founded on very military type style organizations with one leader and the rest is followers. We find that the world of work and society has evolved where people want to collaborate, they want to be heard, they want to be consulted. And there's actually been research done around these different types of leadership styles and the inherent abilities of females versus male leaders. So if the question is, should we put laws in place to ensure that we get to this equal society? My argument would be that the laws is in place, the practices is being communicated. We have bodies like the UN that enforces these sort of gender numbers. But it really boils down to how do we ensure that women have a voice in decision making, number one, and number two, that the talent and skills they have to transform economies is actually being identified. And I think once you have a talent pool and you have a pool for skills and competencies, it actually makes the immigration laws neither here nor there. Because I've never sat around a boardroom table where people said, we don't want to send this individual because they're women. The question is always, do we have the right skills? And are we migrating the right skills to actually grow our businesses?
I'd like to stay on that just for a moment, because I think it's a really nice transition into global mobility and tying this in, right? And how does global mobility empower women with the skills necessary to take the roles where there is a demand? Because I was listening to a podcast with Mary Ibarra. She's the CEO of General Motors here in the United States. I was just blown away by her combination of acumen and empathy, right? And I was like, she just hit a tone that I felt like just was a uniquely, it was feminine and it was amazing, and it was a great combination. And to your point, I think there is a demand for this type of leadership out there and these skills. But then there's other skills, right, that we have to also make sure that they're present as well. How does global mobility become a talent strategy to empower women with the skills necessary to take on those CEO roles or those senior roles?
I think for me, global mobility creates the catalyst. It creates the framework, and for us to move women to get the skills around the world, to draw on skills from different parts of the world. I think in the absence of a global mobility framework, it just becomes too tedious for organizations. But I think global mobility, if framed correctly, structured, policies is in place, and it's a seamless, enjoyable experience, as challenging as it might be to pack up your home and family ties and origins and move for the sake of an organization and to develop your skills. I think that in itself is a catalyst for actually developing the skills that we need. And I've seen it in my cohort with my PhD studies, that the woman that was accelerated into decision-making roles, so chief operations officers, CEOs, were the women that moved out of their field of specialization and left their home countries and actually migrated across different territories. And I think in the absence of a defined global mobility strategy and policy, those experiences would have been so cumbersome to come by. And as much as we're in the digital age, sometimes you just need to be in a country, kick the tires, sit around with the people, experience the culture, and that creates a different dimension to your leadership that you will not necessarily get by just being in your home country or in a head office type of an environment.
This is brilliant, and I have one more question, Sookia. I'm so sorry, man. I feel like I'm monopolizing this conversation, but this is so what is the global mobility program for the African woman look like that will give us the output and the talent that we desire? I mean, what does it look like? How is it different, or is it different? Maybe it's not different. Maybe it's a matter of offering it just more readily, or are there elements that we need to make sure that it has and things that we need to consider?
I think, and I want to bring it back home again. The African woman still wants to be a family woman. We want to make choices about our bodies, having children, choices of life partner. And some of the women that I've interviewed that either migrated with their husbands or some of them on their own, within an African culture, we have very strong extended family networks. So it would be the grandmother, the aunt, the cousin, whoever else would support you, and I've seen it in my research as well, to be there to take care of the children when you're not around. And I think for me, and I'm not sure how this would play out in a westernized environment, but what I found with some of my participants, because I had a few participants, one from the US, Middle East, and the UK, they would need to rely on social resources or nannies or domestics. So you would need to employ the skill to support your family back home whilst you're busy developing your career, or your husband needs to stay home. And within an African context, and this is how we grew up, how I grew up as well, there's always an aunt or a granny or someone at home that helps actually raise these kids. And that could be the nuanced view of the African mobility framework for women, is how do we support them to move? And I'm not talking about, a woman and 12 disciples, but, 1 or 2 extra people to support them as they make this transition. And I think when it comes to children, we can't underestimate the quality of education. So within an African context, you have a few international schools. Like in Johannesburg, we have the American International School, you have the French International School. So those sort of institutions where children will actually go and get good quality education, that is important as well. And then, of course, it is the narrative of sewing back home. And you would know that a lot of the African diaspora, once they move out of Africa, there's a strong link back into Africa. So sewing your finances, time, or support back to the families that you leave behind. And that, for me, I think is one of those things that's very different when you think about how to just move talent around from the developed markets versus moving African women and African talent around.
It sounds like we may need to redefine the family unit in terms of relocation benefits to include the granny or the auntie or whomever else in the family. I mean, is that, would you say that's accurate?
And practically, I haven't seen that. So practically, in my experience with migrating expatriates, it's always a standard family unit. So it's mom, dad, children, and the dog and the cat, right? And I think for me, what I've seen is that oftentimes we would then have with African women moving around, or let's just call it Africans in general, there would be times when they would actually leave their families back home. And then they would migrate, because we had a program with one of the previous multinationals I worked with where we moved talent within Africa. And you would find that the employee would move into another African country and maybe leave their family for a little bit before actually migrating the family through, because there is a solid support network at home that actually supports African families.
Ben, Sookia, does that present an immigration challenge?
It does represent an immigration challenge because a dependent technically, I mean, it depends what region you're talking about it, but a dependent technically is someone that's a spouse or a child of the person that's moving.
Can you have senior dependents? Can you have old, like, can my grandmother be a dependent?
Not for the African region. There are certain regions, for example, the Middle East, where you can get a domestic, I suppose, member of the family that can migrate. But for the African region, that would be a challenge. So that would be problematic. But I'm actually curious, Ben, to almost shift the question back onto you, to just find out if it's okay, but just to find out, compare your perception of Africa or mobility in Africa to what it was before you spoke to Candice, to what she's told you now. And is there a big difference in what your thought? Has this completely changed your mind, or is it similar to what you thought it might be?
I so appreciate this question, because she's opened my eyes and informed me. I know 3 times more about global mobility in the continent of Africa than I knew before we started this conversation 40 minutes ago. This is tremendously enlightening, and I would highly recommend this conversation to so many people. So a couple of things to jump out. One, and I'm just going to speak incredibly candidly, okay? One, because we're friends here, right? One, the level of the sophistication. I'm very impressed. And maybe it's Candice. Candice is my ambassador here. But the level of sophistication of mobility and talent programs, I think is very interesting. I thought it was interesting that you talk about importing talent. That to me makes a lot of sense. That's the way I look at it from a Western standpoint. But now talking about cultivating talent and now for export, I think is fascinating. And the fact that it's there now, that we are there now, to me was pleasantly surprising. Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that there are kind of destinations that make sense based on language, culture, and skill. I think that's very interesting. I think that a lot of the things that Candice, that you discussed, I see parallels when I speak to people in the United States. I see parallels when I speak to people in Latin America. I see parallels when I speak to people in Asia and Europe, even, frankly, when we talk about women, right, and what women need, and the fact that mobility programs aren't designed with women necessarily in mind as the number one candidate. We have that problem in the United States. I mean, and it's kind of, it's sad. It's sad that this problem continues to present itself, and we talk about the patriarchal ideals, right? I mean, gosh, female breadwinners in the United States pose a problem to many families. I mean, let's just be honest. I mean, it's still relatively uncommon here. It's not it's less common. It's less common. It's not the norm, I'll say, right? The norm is still very much the traditional, either, breadwinner male or the dual income similar. But when the woman starts to exceed the man in the relationship, it causes, sometimes can cause family issues. Some of the same things that Candice, you were talking about, if the trailing spouse or accompanying talent, as we like to say on this show, followed the woman around, maybe within his own family, he might receive some grief over that. We're trying to work through those things, and I think this generation that's coming up now is the best yet with it. But it's so interesting to hear a lot of the same. It's a lot more similar than I thought, to be completely honest with you, and I'm still processing. But this is fascinating.
It's in a way surprising. I think that's kind of fair to say. Like we don't know what we always assume maybe the other. We don't know, but it's actually a surprise to actually. For me as well, actually, I would say in the UK, I don't. There are many companies that don't have policies that are advanced or initiatives that empower women. And by the way, I know there are some friends that are watching this right now and do connect with Candice. And I think what's important is for there to be an international community. That's what I'm trying to encourage as much as possible, whether it's South Africa, Africa or Europe or North America. Women leaders across the world should connect with each other and have conversations. And there are countries that are doing very well at that, and there are countries and regions that are not doing as well. And we can learn from each other, I think. And that's very important.
The other thing that Candice brought up that I thought was great, and I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I don't know if there's audio or something going on in the background, but one of the things that Candice, that you brought up that I thought was really interesting, that I'm not sure, I don't think it exists in the United States, but you brought up the idea that if whether we're sending talent or we're bringing talent in, there is an intentional policy around the transference of skills. I love that. I think it's brilliant. I don't see that in mobility programs in the United States. I'd love to hear from people maybe in Asia or in Latin America to see if it's present there, or if you know the answer. I don't know, but that was another interesting thing too, Ben.
And I think for me, we've seen real benefits in terms of having a defined skills transfer plan. Because the reality is when you bring in an expatriate and you've drawn the skill from elsewhere in the world, the level of accelerated learning of your local talent is so much higher. And we know that through adult learning, we learn by experience. So if I'm shadowing you while I'm doing my job and I'm learning how you engage with customers, how you set up a route to market, how technology is stacked up, how you run optimizations, depending on the nature of the business, you have a level of accelerated learning. That formal education, with the best intent in the world, African learning institutions is not as advanced as you have in the West and in the East. So even the university where I'm finishing, University of Cape Town, or some of the other local universities, we might be in the top 100, 200 globally. But you're now learning from a peer that might have gone to one of the best schools within their countries. And that level of accelerated learning actually uplifts the skills. And I think for me, it's really enlightening to hear that my talk today as an African, as a woman, as someone that's spent my life on the African continent is adding value, is that oftentimes because we don't ask the questions, we really don't know this untapped potential that exists within Africa. But potential without exposure is not going to transform our economies. And the exposure, I guess, with global mobility and what I've seen is to bring those skills in, or actually export talent, let them get the exposure, and so that they develop that potential and then realize the potential. And I think it is a long-term play. So for me, it is not a 5-year play. Maybe it's a 50-year play. Maybe it's a 100-year play. But with mobility programs and global mobility frameworks, I think we will eventually start seeing that uplift in the talent database of Africa, if I can call it that.
Sorry, just to jump in quickly, I totally agree, but I also think, Candice, that South Africa have a responsibility as one of the leading nations in the region. And I think what's important in the coming years is to spread that knowledge and the skills, education throughout the more challenging countries in Africa. But I think South Africa is one of the leading, obviously, nations in Africa, and they have to almost spread that throughout the region, and that's something that will be important in the years to come as well.
Yeah, and I think we're getting a little. Yeah, thanks, Candice. I think it's getting a little thing going on there, but we got a couple of comments as well coming in here. So let's make sure we honor our audience here and take some of those comments. And René, never a dull moment working in Africa. That's great. That's fantastic. So some great stuff here. René talking about her, we talked about what does our partner do for us, and the personal board of directors. I'm a huge fan of that idea as well. Shout out to Lynn Greenberg checking in here. Elizabeth shouting out Mercy Joy Ministries, which is fantastic. I'm so glad we could do this. And Candice and Ben, I can't thank you enough. This is tremendous. Elizabeth has a question. If you want to sponsor a child, go to Mercy Joy Ministries down there, mercyjoyministries.org. My wife and I did this. It was like the best thing I did all week. So check it out. But Elizabeth says, what countries are experiencing greater economic growth in Africa and why? Does immigration play a role in that? Yeah, can you give us a sense here? Because this is something I still struggle with. And I look at I refer to the continent of Africa almost as a homogenous area, and it couldn't be more further from the truth. Can you give us some nuance and insight here, Candice and maybe Ben? What countries are experiencing greater economic growth in Africa and why?
So I'm going to talk about my personal experience in South Africa.
Candice, we're going to have to. I'm sorry. Let's take Ben first. It's giving me a little issue with the mute. Yeah.
Well, great question, and this is a teaser for Friday's show, which is just kind of covers immigration from different countries. But the main regions in Africa, from an immigration perspective, are obviously one, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Angola as well, because there's obviously a big oil and gas industry. So we find many corporate clients are sending US nationals, for example, or European nationals to those countries because of the oil and gas industry. That's predominantly where the corporate immigration work comes into. Kenya is another one as well that's emerging. But those are probably the main growth areas in Africa. We sometimes get asked about Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, for example, but it's usually South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana are probably the main immigration kind of hotspots.
So South Africa and then that Western African region kind of there. It sounds like. Now, what about Saharan Africa? Do we even consider that? I mean, help me understand as an outsider here. When we talk about Africa, are we even talking about Saharan Africa, or do we kind of lump that in more culturally with the Middle East?
No. That would be considered, if I get an immigration case, that would be considered part of Africa. I don't find from my perspective anyway, that's not the higher volume work that comes in. It is usually the Western Africa where we usually get most of the work, and it's often short-term travel as well. So it's for example projects for oil and gas companies where people are in for a few weeks at a time, or even just for business purposes as well. So it's very rarely long-term assignments that I have found in the region of Africa from an immigration perspective. But if we have Candice back, I'd like to ask her a question related to that, if that's okay. Candice?
Yeah, let's try it.
One thing that I know you wanted to talk about was cultural integration and looped into the immigration side. Could you just tell us a bit more about that and how you integrate people? Let's say Ben moves his Love and Relo show to South Africa for a year or so. What would you do, and how would you go about integrating Ben and his family into South Africa from a cultural perspective?
And maybe a domestic partner. I may be bringing another domestic with me.
That will remain on the show. So I think that for me, it's a three-pronged approach. So the first, obviously, is what we call the look and see. So this is where we bring the person that we're relocating with the partner or domestic partner, let's call them the significant other for purposes of the show, into the country. And we set up with the relocation agency sort of viewings, schools, cultural setups, how it's done, just to give people a feeling of what this new city or country would feel like and to get a bit of a taste and experience. And that could be over a number of days. What I've also seen in my experience is that we do have in-country service providers that can actually do a full cultural sort of learning and development initiative, where they will take you through the history, the political history of the country, what is the country's core competencies, the macroeconomics, the languages, the tribes, and that's a little bit more intense, so it's more sort of an official program. And of course, if there is a language component, because with some of the multinationals, they would need to pick up 1 or 2 local languages. We then put them on a e-learning program, so typically like through your Rosetta Stones, or it would be an actual coach that we would get in those countries to try and assist them, because you can't experience culture from the outside looking in. You have to immerse yourself in the practices in the city, and for that you need to be able to communicate, and you need to ensure that you sort of can find your way around. And then of course, I think to set them up locally, and this is why indigenization is so important. So on the management team, to try and buddy them with someone to say, okay, fine, this person might take you to a local goods market or the typical malls, etc. Now, what I've explained sounds great, but try it in Lagos. It's not as fun, because you have to think about security. It's one of the most populous cities. I've traveled on occasion into Lagos. There could be 4 lanes that looks like 8 lanes. The people are a bit noisy. So it's a very different dynamic. And what we find maybe with European expatriates, some of them tend to leave their families behind. And then you have this migration of people flying in and out of country every 6 weeks, sometimes every 4 weeks, and it really puts a strain on the talent, and obviously from a cost point of view as well. So again, Africa is not, as you would have in the USA, one big, combined country or continent. Each region has its own specific nuances, and the only way you can experience this is really just to spend time on the ground and actually see what's going on.
This is great. Ben, can we just get 2 more comments here from the audience here? Renee tells me I can't bring a domestic, which is a problem for me, Renee. I may have to leave the family back. I'm not sure. We'll talk about it. We'll sort through it. Gabby, though, has a great question or comment. The goal of bringing back talented expats to their home location in Africa is fascinating from an immigration perspective. Is there a requirement for nationals to return to their country for a certain period of time to bring back certain skills? Thinking of the US J1 visa here. Gabby with amazing questions, always.
Everyone's really thirsty for the immigration day, I think. So I think we should wait and answer that question on Friday. But what I do know is, as I understand, at least in Nigeria, and it does depend by country, that there is initiatives, or there are initiatives, where you do need to upskill locals, for example, in Nigeria. When one person comes out, then you need to upskill the local labor market. So I believe those sorts of training programs exist. I know for sure in Nigeria. It's a double check on South Africa. Candice might know the answer. Otherwise, we can always go back to it on Friday. But I believe there are initiatives like this in the region to promote the local labor workforce. Candice, you might have more information on your side, but I think it's a really important thing, and it's also necessary as well in the region.
Yeah, beyond the skills plans attached to the visas, I'm not sure if there's any requirement for the talent, and I'm not familiar with this J1 visa that she's referring to. So beyond the skills plans, that's as far as it goes from a South African immigration perspective.
Great question, Gabby. To Ben's point, tune in for Friday. We have an immigration bonanza going on there. Also to you, Elizabeth, our sponsor. Again, thank you so much. She has a question about safety and security for expats in Africa. Ben, don't we have a show about that coming up this week? Thursday.
True to everyone's needs.
We're basically reading everybody's mind and also not giving them what they want today, but it's going to make you tune in later in the week, okay? So Elizabeth, stay tuned. Elizabeth's all about the risk. She's like, is there a safety problem? I can insure it. Don't worry, I'll sell you some insurance for it. No, I'm just kidding. Elizabeth's great. But and then René just answers one question, then we'll kind of we're running short on time. But René says, Elizabeth, Africa growth varies from year to year, depends on sector or natural resources available. Our stats change from year to year. Typically, our busy locations are South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Morocco, and at the moment, Mauritius.
Yeah, it's a place to be, Ben. That is really where you want to relocate, Mauritius.
Says the Mauritian in London. But anyway, that's another story. That's another story.
True. Fair point.
At the end of the show, we always open it up for a final word, and I'd like to give you both a final word.
Candice, would you like to go first, or what do you prefer?
I will give you the co-host the first word, and I'll take the second one.
Sure. First of all, thanks for joining Ben and I. I know it's quite late in the evening over there, so I really appreciate it. Thank you for today's sponsor as well. I think that's a really important initiative. This is going to the ministry, so we really appreciate that as well. I think today has been an important lesson on both sides. I think we have learned so much from Candice about mobility and HR policies. And in particular, the one that stood out for me was what measures and what initiatives are actually happening in the region for women, to empower women, to mentor women and give them opportunities that we might not have thought about. But I also think on the other side, I think actually we are living in a more connected world. And some of the issues that we think are exclusive to our regions are global issues. And what's really important is that we need to connect with each other. So anyone watching here, please connect with Candice, and Candice might connect with some of you, because what would be really great is to see a women's network that is international, that supports these causes, where we can learn from each other and find out what common challenges and opportunities there might be to raise the voice of women in global mobility. So that's something that stands out for me. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ben. And I must say, this was really an impromptu, and it had nothing to do with the script that we prepared, which is great. so anything I shared,
I'm sorry.
So anything I shared, it just came straight from my heart, right? And that's how it should be received. But I think for me, one of my favorite quotes, and the person's anonymous, is that women hold up half of the sky. And think about that for a moment. We make up of the world population in Africa, at least 50% is women. Yet we are not considered in key decision-making when it comes to policies, immigration, job opportunities, means of production. And more so, the African woman really has a competence, has a leadership prowess that we offer the world. But it's around how do we tap into it, how do we identify it? And I think through forums like this, global mobility, women's networks, cross-collaboration across countries, you will find that there's more Candices that you're going to find in the African continent. And if there isn't more Candices, then I have failed in my own leadership journey, right? And it's around how do we tap into that untapped potential? And yes, I hear the questions around, which economies is growing and is it safe in Africa? But what COVID has taught me, and that's really become a reality, is that our humanity is really what connects us. Our humanity is really what drives economies forward. People do business with other people. It's about relationships. And that's what I've seen traveling across Africa, Europe, and the West. If there's one competence African people have, it's a relational competence. It's that social acumen that we have to do business, support, and to really integrate. So really, to the co-host Ben, and to René for introducing me to the show. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm willing to connect with people that share similar interests around this topic. Thank you, Ben.
Candice, this has been such a pleasure having you here today. I've learned so much. You were so insightful. Thank you so much for speaking from the heart. It is always best that way. And Ben, thank you so much for curating such wonderful discussions. And René, shout out to you, backstage there too, for being the brains behind the scenes. Thank you so much. This has been truly, truly an honor to host this conversation, and I'm so excited that we are going to be hosting this conversation for the next 4 days as well, and keeping the Africa Week going here on Love and Relo. We've got a phenomenal show tomorrow with some great folks in the logistics arena. Rolf Lammers and Kim Becker coming to us tomorrow, Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time here in the States, GMT -5 there. And thank you so much, everybody that tuned in. We couldn't have done this without you. Hit a like, throw a little heart out there to Candice and Ben and the rest of our guests this week. Appreciate you so much out there. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And we will see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time in the US. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.